Okay. All right. So welcome to the presentation on the rose growing industry in Richmond Hill. And we are presenting a history of a blooming important industry. So moving on. I'm starting out the presentation with Gormley and Bond Lake. So in the early 20th century, with Lake Wilcox and Gormley communities bustling in industry, Richmond Hill Council set up a committee to encourage industries to locate here in Richmond Hill. The first to do so was a gentleman named William Lawrence, and Lawrence was, he was a Toronto florist, and he was president of the Canadian Horticultural Society, and he had a wholesale and retail florist business in Toronto that he opened in 1898. And by the early 1900s, Lawrence was running out of land because he was in Toronto. So he needed more land to grow his flowers, and greenhouses being first established at the time, there was more room to grow up in Richmond Hill. So no pun intended there. And if you look at these slides, we've got some great slides of Oak Ridges. This is the Bond Lake power plant that powered the radio car. These are the gentlemen working in the plant. And this is the Colbert Johnson General Store. And of course, Gormley train station. Train stations were a really big, important part of industry, for industry in not just Richmond Hill, but anywhere in the 19th century, early 20th century. So in 1911, William Lawrence bought John Palmer's farm. So here's John Palmer's farm right here. This is Richmond Hill. So along here, this is Major Mackenzie Drive, and this is Yonge Street, okay? So we have the land on the east side was where the Canadian National Railway line was. So if we are looking over this way, that's where your Canadian National Railway was. And of course, on Yonge Street at the time, 1911, we had something called the radio car running up and down Yonge Street, which was a great transportation between Holland Landing and, of course, the town of York, which is Toronto. And the railway was, again, essential for rose growers and the people of Richmond Hill for shipping freight as well as for traveling. So this is what the greenhouses looked on the outside. So this is Lawrence's greenhouse in Richmond Hill. And if you want to get an idea of where it was, if we go back to the map, it was along the end of Roseview Avenue. So here is Roseview here. So we're looking at the end of Roseview Avenue where these particular greenhouses were located. So there's one. Here's the inside. So by the summer of 1912, this huge greenhouse was built, and it was the first building was in operation producing cut roses for the retail shops in Toronto for William Lawrence, and it measured 214 meters long by 27 meters wide, and the second building housed the boiler which supplied the steam to heat the greenhouses. And there was a third building just east of the greenhouse, contained an office, cold storage facilities, and a packing room. So inside, you can notice that the plants are being grown right in the ground and not on benches as the practice was later on. And here's the greenhouse here. And you can see the packing, the steamer here with the little smokestack there. And this is Lawrence's house. So here is a better picture of the house. And if you do a nice little walk down Roseview Avenue today, this is what it looks like today. So it's just at the corner of Roseview Avenue and I believe Lawrence Avenue. So did you know on that particular area in 1884, John Palmer, he actually sold 4.5 acres of that land for $180, and it was in exchange for another farm to be a potential park. A grandstand was built by Citizens Committee, and soon the Village Park, as it was known, was the home of the Young Canadians lacrosse team and the Richmond Hill and Yonge Street Agricultural Society Spring Fair. In 1888, the Village Lockup was built, and in 1903 came the lawn tennis court. And this is the Spring Fair in the 1900s. And the fair relocated to Richmond Green in 1986, and the last year of the fair was in 1996. The park was located just northwest of where William Lawrence had his greenhouse, and it would have been there at the time of that the industry was growing. So it was kind of, you had the greenhouses, and you had the Spring Fair, and you had more greenhouses to the south or to the north. And the park is still here today with the land expansion and is home to Elgin Barrel Arena and the Richmond Hill Lawn Bowling Club and a ball diamond and tennis courts. And we know it today as Town Park. And it is still a place for family fun and recreation. So let's think about it. What else was going on in 1911? So you got to kind of put yourself back in that time. So the Fire and Light Committee was formed to bring back the electricities so that the Toronto and York Railway Company from Bond Lake to the village. So that little building I showed you at the very first slide, that was the power plant. The population of the village of Richmond Hill was 652 people. And a gentleman named William Graham, we're going to talk about him a few times through this presentation. He was only 30 years old, and he started his own contracting business. And he builds 31 houses, the Loyal True Blue and Orange home, which is located on North Yonge Street, the Richmond Hill Public School, which is now the McConaughey Center, and the arena, the Village Park, were to be his projects. So fun facts. The rose is, according to fossil evidence, 35 million years old. And this gentleman here, this is a picture of John Dunlop. Now, William Lawrence also introduced John Dunlop, and he was a rival florist from Toronto and a former president of the Canadian Horticultural Society. And he introduced him to Village Council in 1913. And Lawrence felt that having more florists coming up to Richmond Hill would be an advantage as the demand for roses was so great, and some of these large orders could be supplied by one town, which would benefit the customer. John Dunlop had a well-established operation in Toronto, consisting of wholesale and retail outlets, just like Lawrence did. And Dunlop was also looking for more space to start growing his industry. So here on the map, same map, we got Major Mac, and we have Yonge Street, and this is Center Street here. So he had recently purchased land from Amos Wright, of all people, and of course Amos's property is just here north of Center Street, lot 47 there. And he moved his operations to Richmond Hill just after the Village Council agreed to a tax break. So here is a picture of Dunlop's greenhouses. He began a large flower growing operation, and in August 1913, he had 2 operational greenhouses and 6 more planned. So he had a big business running. So here is his packing building. John Dunlop, he developed, one of the things, his claim to fame is he developed several strains of roses, and among them, the Rose of Toronto and the deep pink Frank W. Dunlop rose. He helped organize the Toronto Gardener and Florist Association, the Canadian Horticultural Society, and of course, our local Horticultural Society. And as future support for the Society aims, he frequently donated prizes for the Society competitions. Dunlop roses quickly won acclaim, and in March 1914, 50 of his Richmond roses were awarded first prize at the International Rose Show in New York City. And in April 1916, his flowers garnered 3 first place and 2 second places at the National Flower Show in Philadelphia. So here's a picture of him and his family. And by the spring of 1915, Dunlop was shipping over 10,000 carnations across Canada as well as Easter lilies to Montreal. So it wasn't just roses that Dunlop was into. He had the carnation as well as the Easter lilies. And I think some of his employees, the employees got into growing some of their own little plants and stuff. There were lemon trees in the greenhouses. So these are price cards. They are from Dunlop Toronto greenhouses, and the beauties that are out of stock are the long stem rose variety, American Beauty, which was a favorite choice of greenhouses in the early 20th century. And it was also the rose that that movie was named after. So here's our map again. The Richmond Hill was so desirable for the industry. Another floral company or gentleman named H.J. Mills at the same time also moved north from Toronto looking for more space. So the Mills, they bought 4 acres of land in 1912 from J. Sharedown, which was the north side of Center Street. So it would have been north up here in this area. And he set up H.J. Mills Limited and built 2 greenhouses, exclusively growing roses. So that was his thing. Mills won top prizes at the Royal Agricultural Winter Fair in Toronto. And the 3 Richmond Hill greenhouse operators businesses, Lawrence, Dunlop, and Mills, were friendly competitors. They often worked together to fill large orders and bring visiting delegations of horticulturalists to the village. So during the First World War, their cooperation intensified out of necessity as they had to share carloads of rationed of coal. So think about it. What else was going on between 1912 and 1913? Well, in 1912, temperance people persuaded council to vote down a motion to repeal the local option bylaw. Richmond Hill was a dry town. So you had a lot of sober workers working in the greenhouses, we hope. In December 30th, 1912, electricity supplied by Toronto and New York Railway Company, the metropolitan successor, used for street lights and some businesses in the village. So electricity was coming to Richmond Hill Village, not just for the radio car. And in March 1913, Richmond Hill Electric Light and Power Commission formed with J.H. Sanderson as the first chairman, Sanderson being a well-known, recognized Richmond Hill name. So after listing a number of properties that were being improved, August 1913, the Liberal concluded that we are the last in the swim and making rapid advances into municipal importance. By December 1918, the Liberal could no longer keep track of improvements and concentrated instead on new residences being built, 27 in the preceding 12-month period. Many of these new homes were situated east of Church Street, between today's Roseview Avenue and Major Mackenzie Drive, where William Lawrence was developing the new subdivision of Roseview Gardens. So if you're familiar with that area, there's Baker Street, there's Ruggles, and there's Lawrence Avenue. All those little houses down there were built by William Lawrence. Switching to his property development role in 1913, Lawrence began selling building lots along present-day Baker's, Ruggles, and Lawrence Avenue. So that was his thing. He kind of got out of the rose growing industry at that point. So this is a picture of William Graham's house. He was the contractor, and he built at 90 Center Street East in 1911. The house is still there. Mrs. Graham is sitting on the steps, so that's her there. And we have her husband and the eldest child, Philip. They sit in their new 1914 Model T. Everybody had Model Ts back then, because of course Henry Ford was making it big down further south. In Roseview Gardens and all around the town, contractors were in great demand, and one of the most sought after builders was William Graham. And again, from a previous slide, he had established a contracting business in the community in 1911, and he was only 30 years old. So he's done very well for himself. Over the course of the next 13 years, again, he built McConaughey Center, Loyal True Blue and Orange Home, the public school in Stouffville, which looks just like McConaughey Center. He's he did the second Patterson School west of town, and an arena in the village park was his, and of course numerous commercial buildings. By the time of William Graham's death in 1924, Richmond Hill was a village rejuvenated. So he has his mark on a lot. So everybody recognizes this. This is our town crest. As the rose growing industry continued to prosper, it became more distinct part of Richmond Hill's identity and was eventually written into the village's motto. In 1919, council asked a local carriage builder and artist, William Ashford Wright, to design a crest for its official stationery and for the 2 large signs erected at each end of the village, which proclaimed Richmond Hill as Toronto's highest and healthiest suburb. Wright took his design from the top of the coat of arms of the 4th Duke of Richmond as a salute to the Duke's visit back in 1819, and his possible role as the community's namesake. Wright also borrowed the Duke's motto, which was now uncannily appropriate. On the rose, j'ai fleuri, which freely translates as, like the rose, I bloom. I bloom as the rose, or in the rose I flourish, which indeed the town has. So here's another version of the crest. These are all in our collection now because these are past designs. So it's not all about a bed of roses for the rose industry. Basically, if you want to look at this little motto here, it's a situation where there are unpleasant things to deal with as well as the pleasant ones. So growing roses was not always easy for the industry. Lawrence encountered structural issues. So in 1913, due to heavy snows, a collapsed roof damaged by strong winds, freezing temperatures that froze thousands of roses in the spring of 1914. The lack of support from the village to help him rebuild. And in 1919, that's when he decided to sell his business. He got into the development business instead, and he sold to Oldfield and Cotton, who later became Richmond Roses in the 1930s. John Dunlop, unfortunately, he suddenly died of a heart attack in September 1930, and his Richmond Hill greenhouse operations were purchased by Harold Mills, H.J. Mills, in April of 1934, which doubled Mills' capacity. So here's another company that came in, Bedford Park. By 1934, the companies of H.J. Mills, Richmond Roses, which was the original Lawrence greenhouses, and also the Bedford Park Floral Company employed about 80 men and several women. In its heyday, the rose industry also supported many community programs such as the Richmond Hill High School Tatler and took part in local parades. So this is actually an ad in the Tatler, the yearbook of the Richmond Hill High School, which was then on Wright Street. And here is Crosby Hall. It's really difficult to see Crosby now, but that would have been the view from Yonge Street back in the 1930s. So the history of this little house, it's a big house. The history of this house was Parker Crosby back in 1861. He bought 30 acres of lot 48, concession 1 in Markham Township by, guess who, Amos Wright. He owned everything then. And remember back then, back before Richmond Hill became a village, the east side of Yonge Street was Markham Township. So 2 years later, he built Crosby Hall facing Yonge Street. And the York Herald in August 1863 described the dwelling as a palatial with a neat cupola atop and an indispensable veranda in front. So this is it's a really cute feature, and it's something that's makes the house unique. There are 12 rooms and a kitchen, wash house, and a woodshed adjoining. And Mr. John Story, builder, may confidently point to his building as his chef d'ordure. Parker and his wife, Mary Holmes, moved out of their mansion in 1889. They were settling in a town residence. Isaac Crosby and his third wife, Amy C. Hutchison, moved into Crosby Hall. Parker died in 1901, followed by Isaac in 1911, at which time the family ownership of Crosby Hall lapsed. In 1920, the property was purchased by the Bedford Floral Company, after which the Bedford Park Avenue is named. Crosby Hall is occupied by the company managers. And right now the address of this site is 38 Bedford Park Avenue. So it's no longer a Yonge Street address. You can no longer see it from Yonge Street, but it is tucked away there on Bedford Park. And it is somebody's private home. So don't go peeking in the windows. Joan, that's for you. Just kidding. Side 29. This is our this is another view of, this is another view of the Crosby Hall. And here's slide 29 is our aerial view of what the greenhouses looked in the 1930s. So this was at the top of the this was the big time. So this is looking west from the Canadian National Railroad tracks towards Yonge Street. So if you were standing at Center Street and Pugsley Avenue area, the train station, just where the tracks are, this is what you would see if you're looking towards Yonge Street. So the top center here, H.J. Mills, and then we have Dunlop greenhouses are down here. And then we have the Bedford Park to the right over here. So I think that's, my doodles are very good. So here is a map. And this is, gives you a better overview of what it would have looked like. This is actually a map of Richmond Hill, a recent map of Richmond Hill, but we've put the actual cutouts of the greenhouses of where they would have been. So here is Richmond Hill Roses or Lawrence greenhouses here, where Roseview Avenue is. So here's Roseview. And then here is Coventry Court. So here is Bedford Park is up here. Sorry. And then H.J. Mills is here. So that's basically how it'll look like in 1930. So think about it. What else was going on in the 1930s? Well, 1929 in October, the stock market crashed. In 1931, the population of the village was 1,295, and it was an increase due to the horticultural industries. People were coming to Richmond Hill for jobs. In 1931, council reduces the salary of town workers by 10%, saving $617. And in 1932, the Richmond Hill Board of Education reduces the pay of principals by 8% and teachers by 25%. And by 1933, 26% of Canada's labor force was unemployed. So this was a pretty rough time during the Depression. So, but the rose growing industry kept it going in Richmond Hill. We were doing very well. People were employed at the greenhouses in Richmond Hill. By 1935, that's when Oldfield and Cotton becomes Richmond Hill Roses, or sorry, Richmond Roses. Again, that was William Lawrence's original greenhouses. May 1935, the David Dunlop Observatory officially opens. November 15th, 1935, the village once again votes to stay dry, had to add that. In June 6, 1939, this was a pretty exciting time for Richmond Hill. It was a visit by King George VI and Queen Elizabeth. So it was Bertie and the Queen Mum, as we called her in our time. They made the trip through Canada, including Richmond Hill. So they took the railroad trip down through the Richmond Hill train station. So here they are. And this is a really cute story because they visited on the Royal train heading towards Richmond Hill, and the train station, there was all the people from Richmond Hill, the whole village came out to see them. And the anxious crowd was awaiting them, their arrival. And this is what happened, is that the train was a little late. And little be known at the DDO site, the David Dunlop Observatory site. Remember, the DDO just opened in 1935. This is 99, and of course the DDO, the actual dome was made in England. It was made by it was built by Grubb Parsons, who was a shipping company in England, and the Queen insisted she wanted to see the she wanted to see this dome. She wanted to see this observatory that was built in England because it was the largest observatory in Canada. So they actually stopped the train. She actually had the train stop at the DDO so they could see the dome. And when they got to the Richmond Hill train station, they were behind schedule, so they only slowed the train down. The train did not stop. So there's a little girl here. You can see her right here. And you can see this bouquet being thrown up into the train. This little girl was asked to present the bouquet to the Queen, and here's the bouquet there, and it missed its mark. And unfortunately, the little girl chosen to present the bouquet tossed it to Her Majesty, but fortunately, she missed her mark and it tumbled to the ground. But it was reeve green, and of course, back then when we were a village, the mayor would have been called a reeve. He retrieved the bouquet and gave it to the Queen. And that bouquet was supplied by H.J. Mills. So it always has that special history. And I have to throw this in. And I know that the Historical Society, you had the fortunate, we're very fortunate to have a presentation on the Eaton family, and you got to have a little tour of the Eaton Hall up at Seneca College. So this actual train here, this is the Pullman car, and it was built by Sir John Eaton of Eaton's Canada Limited. The original Eatonia, that's what it was called, was built by his father, Timothy Eaton, but it was destroyed by fire. So this is the Eatonia 2. To support the war effort, in World War I, Sir John offered the Eatonia for the duration. And in 1917, after the Halifax explosion, the Eatonia was filled to the brim with supplies for recovery. And Sir John and a team of staff from the Eaton's outfit survivors with clothing and household needs to get them back to their feet. The Eatonia 2 was sold to the Canadian Pacific Railway. And in 1939, this was the same Pullman car which carried, go back, that's the same Pullman car that was owned by the Eaton family. So this photo is actually celebrates CP Railway returning the Pullman car back to the Eatons of Canada Limited. And what they did is they presented the Eatonia. It got restored and it's now on display at Canadian Heritage Park Calgary Heritage Park in the city of Calgary. But that's I think it's, here is John Craig Eaton Jr., who was one of the sons or grandsons of Timothy Eaton that took over the actual department store. So that was just a fun little history. So we have some more fun facts. This is a 1908 painting by Henry Payne of the scene in the Temple Garden from Shakespeare's play, Henry VI, Part 1, where supporters of the rival factions pick either red or white roses. So, during the 15th century, the rose was used as a symbol for the factions fighting to control England. The white rose symbolized York and the red rose symbolized Lancaster, and as a result, the conflict became known as the War of the Roses. And here we have H.J. Mills promotion. So Harold J. Mills was an expert, he would be called, in promotion, and he was the first to use the Trans-Canada Airlines Air Express flight in 1938 to ship roses out west. So during the Great Depression, Mills managed to find regular buyers for his roses. Also, Mills roses were again presented to the Queen Elizabeth in Ottawa during their 1939 visit. And as the century progressed, roses began to be shipped primarily by airplane. Probably the most famous Richmond Hill rose shipment was the gift of 100 choice roses from the 3 main greenhouses in Richmond Hill, and they were flown across the Atlantic on November 17th, 1947, for the wedding of Princess Elizabeth and Prince Philip. So there's a picture of, again, 1939 visit to Canada. That's Bertie, Prince George, or King George, sorry, and Queen Elizabeth, his wife. And there is Queen Elizabeth, Princess Elizabeth, sorry, and Prince Philip when they were married. She was still princess then. And did you know Prime Minister Trudeau was well known for wearing that rose on his lapel? There it is. And his daily roses were supplied by H.J. Mills. So here is the rose industry workers. These are some great historical pictures of our workers doing their thing. And this one here is of rose grafting. And H.J. Mills in the 1940s, they were known for their grafting of their roses. And what grafting is, or budding is another term for it. It's a technique for propagating plants wherein you take the piece from one plant and fuse it into another. So it's kind of like breeding roses. And these are the gentlemen that are grading the roses. And I love this picture because I love this gentleman here. He's got his hat on and he's smoking a cigarette. That's very different times, definitely for working. And then I later found out that that is our mayor's uncle, that he worked there for a number of years at H.J. Mills. So the cut rose industry was very labor intensive, and here roses are being graded before packing for shipping at H.J. Mills. And I think it was at a presentation I did on this, when I showed this slide, I think the mayor was sitting in the audience. He's like, that's my uncle. So I thought that was cute. H.J. Mills floors operation in 1948, pictured left to right are Doug Lowry, Alex Peters, Howard Van Dyke, James Pollard. So I believe that's James Pollard here, because that was the mayor's uncle. And there's Stan Baker, H.J. Mills, Bill Fisher, and Norman Stevenson, and Bill Horner. So the boxes were initially wooden, built by the men and the stockpiled during the slow periods. And later pre-cut cardboard ones were later available, which could be folded and stapled by hand. All the roses on the floor grade were rejected. So all these ones down here on the floor, they would just toss them on the ground. And then what I understand is they would get thrown outside the door of the grading, or the grading building, and little girls would pick them up and take them home to their moms as little presents. So the broken roses were later collected by an independent operator and wired for boutonnieres and corsages as well. So these are all roses ready for packing. So you can see they're all in their little buckets, and these are the crates beside, ready to be loaded. So prior to 1938, when the wooden boxes were used, the roses were laid down with the rose heads side by side. At the end of 6 or 7 rows, a small wooden stick called a cleat was wedged in to keep the roses from shifting during transport. The rows of roses were carefully arranged so that the rose head did not lay on top of another one. Chipped ice was then sprinkled over the stems and a layer of newspaper placed over the iced tea. This process was later repeated for another 6 or 7 layers before the lid of the box was nailed and wired down. So here's some more of our greenhouse workers. This is Arthur Leach. And Art Leach is sitting on the cold frames at H.J. Mills to bring a newly grafted roses out of the nursery to these frames. So they would lay them out on there. The cabbage in the foreground were grown between nursery rows crops and sold to the St. Lawrence Market in Toronto. So that's this picture's in 1936. So again, between seasons, they would come up with other produce or flowers to grow in the greenhouses. So here's Arthur Leach again. This is at H.J. Mills. And here's a buying trip. They're all, some of the staff from H.J. Mills, they get ready to go on a rose buying trip to the Dale Estates in Brampton, which I'm gonna bring up later on. They are posed in front of the building Mills bought from John Dunlop in the early 1950s. And a lot of these photos that you're seeing here are courtesy of one of our residents who has since passed, and it was Charlie Bancroft. He was an employee of the Mills greenhouses for a number of years. And many of you in this society would know who Charlie is. So here is a letter to the Ontario Fertilizers from H.J. Mills to remind them to deliver to the radio car station. And it's actually, if you really read this letter, it's actually pretty snively, I guess. I don't know what the term you would want to use, but it's like, that was the idea, is that somebody, I guess they delivered it, they didn't deliver it to the radio car station, they delivered it somewhere else. But the radio car station and the radio car was a great way of transportation from the city of Toronto or the town of York, what was city of Toronto then, and bringing up the, being able to transport to and from. And I love this, the old-fashioned way of booking your holidays. List of the employees of H.J. Mills and a list of the vacation dates. And it looks like they only got a week each, because it just has like the 4th to the 13th. Maybe they got 2 weeks, but it lists all of them, and they got posted when you could take your holidays. And here is a break time at the Dunlop greenhouses in 1930s. And here we got another group of them. There's a clown in every group. He's got a flower pail on his head here. It's really cute. And a Bedford employee. And this is Ken Shields. He has a lemon tree at the Bedford Park Floral Company. And this is taken sometime in the 1930s. And here's some two boys at the CNR station in the mid-30s. This is Bob Edmonds and John Tracy, and they're on their bikes. And these boys grew up in Richmond Hill, and I remember them as older gentlemen. The boxes on the wagon contain roses ready for shipping. So there they are, ready to go. And some more fun facts. Here's Cleopatra. That's Elizabeth Taylor. So Cleopatra and her living quarters, she always had her living quarters filled with petals of roses, so that when Mark Antony met her, he would long remember her for such opulence and be reminded of her every time he smelled a rose. Her scheme worked for him. Such is the power of roses. And it's a changing industry. The rose industry was Richmond Hill's major employer during the early half of the last century. In fact, the greenhouses played a key role in Richmond Hill's ability to survive the Great Depression, and they also contributed significantly to the economic and demographic growth of the village. By 1939, over 100 workers were injecting $250,000 in wages into the local economy. That year, the industry produced about 4 million roses. Even today's standards, Richmond Hill's horticultural industry was massive, with the village shipping millions of roses and other flowers across Canada and to the United States on an annual basis. In the years that followed, there were many changes in Richmond Hill that impacted the rose industry. So what happened? Ironically, as the village grew, the rose industry became less profitable. There was more money to be made in selling the land that the greenhouses were on for housing developments. H.J. Mills Limited, representing the last of the original greenhouses, eventually moved from 83 Dufferin Lane, now Dunlop Avenue, to a new location north of Elgin Mills on Bayview Avenue. Then, due to recession and high interest rates and the increasing fuel costs, H.J. Mills was forced into receivership in June of 1982. It was a sad day for Richmond Hill and the 45 employees of the firm who lost their jobs. The H.J. Mill greenhouses on Bayview Avenue were taken over by Richmond Greenhouses. But the market was changing. Growing cut roses in Richmond Hill was no longer economically viable due to global competition. In fact, more than half of the cut roses sold in North America during the 1980s came over from Ecuador and Colombia, as these countries had lower overhead and labor costs. So in 1997, Richmond Greenhouses pulled the plug on their cut roses operation and began growing potted mini roses and chrysanthemums. Gerald Vanderlug, who says this is Gerald here, he stands next to a vertical trolley transporting the mini roses for shipping. So that was pretty well the end of our rose growing industry in Richmond Hill. But did you know, I've been asked this a few times, and I've added it into the presentation, because we're often asked if there's other towns or cities in competition with Richmond Hill's rose industry at the time. And the answer is yes. So Edward Dale is an immigrant from Dorking, England, established a flower nursery in Brampton shortly after his arrival in 1863. Dale's nursery became the town's largest and most prominent employer, developed a flower grading system, and established a global export market for its products. At its height, the company had 140 greenhouses, primarily for roses, and was the largest cut flower business in North America, and by 1956 producing 20 million blooms and introducing numerous rose and orchid varieties and species to the market. It also spurred the development of other nurseries in the town. 48 hothouse flower nurseries once did business in Brampton. So Richmond Hill was known as the rose growing capital of Canada, where Brampton was the flower/town city of Canada. Brampton started earlier and was a larger industry specializing in many variety of cut flowers. Similar to Richmond Hill, the 1960s and 70s took their toll on the business due to the rising fuel costs and a decrease in market for flowers. The company was sold, production eventually slowed to the point that the company closed for good in 1980. So as we finish off, we are clocking out. So we're clocking out as our rose workers are doing here at H.J. Mills Limited. And I want to thank you for joining me and giving me this opportunity to do this presentation on Zoom. Very different. And again, sharing this important, blooming important story of Richmond Hill's past. Thank you.